everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Discomfort-Zone podcast. My name is Olev. I thank you all for being here in chat or listening elsewhere. As always, the views and opinions represented in this show are entirely my own and don't represent MSP Waves or anyone else for that matter. So, let's get started. As I mentioned last week, this episode is going to be the next in the series that we were doing amidst all of this corona madness. Maybe we'll take a few moments to speak of other matters. Hopefully, I have quite a lot to get through, but hopefully we'll be able to bring this whole thing back to the current state as well. But for now, we're going to start off with something a little different. And so, Crimson Cloud, thank you for joining. Well, I hope everything is okay. I hope you're all safe and well wherever you are, and that you are making your way through these very, very unexpected, interesting times. Yes, I mean, we'll talk more about it in coming episodes. But for now, this episode is called Natural Farming. And that is a term that was actually coined by a famous nowadays Japanese agronomist. And so before I get into what natural farming actually means and where this term comes from, I want to talk a little bit about, I think, the importance of this subject. And this is something that's not only a core value, idea, philosophy of the eco-village model, but also one of these sort of skills and ways of looking at the world that can really aid us in our everyday life as well, I feel at least. And so this term, natural farming, was coined by the Japanese agronomist Masanobu Fukuoka. Now, he wrote a book that became rather famous, called The One Straw Revolution. That was certainly the first book of his that I read, and his story is very interesting because I think there are many people who are like him in that his history, where he came from, was really part of the system. And so, yes, he was an agronomist. So maybe I should start by actually defining what an agronomist is. And so agronomy is the Western study, the scientific study of food production and all things related to food production. And so if we talk about permaculture, or if we talk about food forests, they could be discussed in the context of agronomy. But for many, many years, the general view of the whole field of agronomy was the view that we sort of still see today, which was chemical fertilizers and having everything sterilized and everything sort of under control and measurements, and making the earth a laboratory for experiments to see what increase would, bring the best yield per energy that was inputted, etc., etc. And so that whole field that really gave us the industrial agricultural revolution of the last, let's say, 100, 200 years, was this field of agronomy. And so that's the environment that this person, Masanobu Fukuoka, grew up in, and in fact studied and became a working agronomist. And so his whole worldview was just that, was that this whole system that we have in nature of growing food in order to sustain ourselves was a very mathematical, scientific process. And it was something that needed to be studied very carefully and measured in order for it to bring the best results. And there was a story that sort of started him on his way. And this story has really stuck with me to this day. In fact, in the book that we wrote, my wife and I, we mentioned this story specifically because I think it holds a lot of truth in it. And the story goes like this. This is how he tells it, at least, or how I remember him telling it. He was walking down the road once, coming back from work, And he noticed that on the side of the road, there was this wild rice that was just growing there. And just a few a distance away, where he could see, there were rice paddies with many workers toiling the land and tilling it and doing all this work. And he looked at this wild rice that was just growing by the side of the road, and he noticed that there wasn't that much difference. There wasn't this obvious difference in the quality, in the size, in the health of this wild rice that was growing. And yet this rice was growing completely unattended. There was nobody watering it, nobody feeding it fertilizer, nobody weeding around it. And yet in this other field, there were all of these workers who were spending hours and so much energy, investing so much to achieve, to the naked eye at least, the same result. And so this sort of started, it sparked inside of him this question of how can this be? And it led to a research, which I believe he is still doing today, if I'm not mistaken, of over 40 years on his land where he has a farm. And the thinking behind it was really rather simple. What is it that human beings are doing to aid the plants? What is it that we are doing that actually has a positive effect? And within that, identify what are the things that we're doing that doesn't have a positive effect, and indeed what are the things that we're doing that is actually having a negative effect and a negative impact. And it was in these criteria that Fukuoka started thinking. And I've mentioned him before a few times, and he has some very simple rules. Obviously, one of the most important, crucial ones that he really emphasizes again and again is the complete lack of use of any chemicals, fertilizers or pesticides or any kind of biocides. He is completely against importing any external chemicals, and anything that needs to be done, he produces naturally on the land. Now, obviously, this is a concept and a way of thinking that really is a big part of how the eco-village is supposed to develop. And there's two reasons for this way of thinking and why it's so special. And I want to talk about two of those. One is that it's actually less work. And what I mean by that is that when you consider all of the things that people do to grow food, and we'll get later on into what it can expand on from just growing food, but to start off with, when we talk about food production, which obviously impacts how much we pay for food as well, there is an enormous amount of work that's put in. And I first noticed this when I came back from reading this book and from reading Fukuoka's whole theory and seeing it being put into practice and working and producing the same yields that the other farmers, the other conventional farming methods were being able to produce. I came back from India, and we were telling people, and we were speaking about our plans and telling them that we wanted to grow our own food. And nearly everyone, certainly of, I'd say, the mainstream crowd, had the same response. And that was, you can't do it. It's impossible to grow enough food for you to eat. And if it is possible, even if you could do it, it requires so much work. And people were talking about 10, 12-hour days every single day, never being able to take a break, never being able to go on holiday, because as soon as you leave, the whole place collapses. And I realized that the reason they think that is because it's true, because that's exactly how modern agriculture works. And that's why you have the need for these very heavy machines to do all of that heavy work for you, because it's too much for people to do. So you get giant tractors that have this immense horsepower that can, till through so many acres. And being here in Portugal now and seeing a lot of these traditional farmers, each with their tractor tilling the land and just ripping through it, it's something very real for me right now in my experience. You can actually see the effects. You see these fields that are being completely plowed empty, and they are then sowed and things grow, but all of the life that was building there seems to be destroyed in that effort. It's a very sad sight for me to see, but there is certainly much to be learned from tradition as well. There are just other things that can be improved upon. And so whenever I would meet with these people, or whenever I'd have to talk to people about how much work is actually involved in food production, it would really come to this theory of natural farming. And so I want to take a moment just to say that natural farming and everything that I'm talking about in this episode is actually, in my mind, a sort of broad umbrella for everything that is sustainable, everything that is what we term self-sufficiency. When we look at permaculture, we see that the systems that they are trying to design are systems that are permanent, and they are trying to improve upon the common agronomy that was accepted in those days and transform that agriculture into a more permanent one. Well, the way to do that, and the way it's being done, is by mimicking or by strengthening the natural systems so that they grow robust and be able to sustain themselves without your further input. And that's exactly natural farming. When we think of the food forest systems, which I did an episode about, again, that's natural farming in practice. It's one small example of looking at the work that nature does, as it is the forest system, looking at all of the organisms that are interacting, looking at all the elements, and seeing, instead of us having to regulate the soil's acidity levels and keep an eye on the minerals that are being transferred in the waters and spreading out the fertilizer, the forest system does that. The root networks of both the mycorrhizal, the mushroom, the mycelium roots, and the plant roots, the tree roots, and the bacteria, all of these organisms are working under the ground in the soil to do exactly what the agronomists were trying to mimic in their labs, and ultimately, if not failing to do, at least not doing as well. And so this idea of natural farming really is the core, the underlying substrate for this entire new way of thinking about both food production and the eco-village as a whole. So it's very important for me to emphasize that when we're talking about natural farming, it's really a new way of thinking. And when I mentioned the two different fields, one of them I said was that it really requires less work, which means you're trying to create a system that requires minimum to no input over time. And so when we think about this, let's say mechanically or technologically, we see that there is obviously this real desire to achieve a system that has stability, whether it's a software system, which is more theoretical, whether it's a physical machine, which I'd say is more practical. It's always about finding a system that will be working autonomously without you, as it were, so that I don't have to do the work. Well, when it comes to measuring the efficiency of these systems and indeed the simplicity of them, there is no other method that I know that is more capable than the natural method, which we call growing. And so growing is a very special and unique way of, let's say, complexifying or developing. When we think of building, a chair or even building a robot, we don't actually grow it. We sort of put it together piece by piece. We have the idea of it in our head, but when we're actually fitting it together, the pieces don't grow together. They're more fused in one way or another. When we look at natural systems, that's never the case. You never have pieces being put together very mechanically. You always have the whole system growing, and the different parts in it are growing differently according to their needs, whether it's the stem or the roots of a plant, whether it's neurons or veins, doesn't matter. The natural system grows cohesively together. And that's what actually makes it a much more stable system, because as time goes on, those pieces that are growing together, as it were, those pieces are actually becoming more and more fused together. The system as a whole develops more harmoniously and more in more synchronicity with itself. And so I think this phenomenon, it's no accident that the field of computer technology, the field of software development in general, has really leaned into this method. And if any of you know about the latest AI developments, what they've developed are these AI neural networks, really and truly, in which they are trying to mimic the way that neurons develop, the way that a brain develops a neural network, because both that is the most efficient way of doing it, but it's also the simplest way, as it were. What it really needs, and this is what's sort of, in a way, it's quite interesting, is it needs time to grow. You can't force it. You can't program what it will learn. You actually have to feed it, you know, the hours of time that's necessary. So if you have no background in any kind of concept of what these AI neural networks are, I'll just very briefly say, because they're being used more and more, whether it's in these sort of deep fake softwares where they can make people look like someone else. They've got these videos out of famous people and mimic their voice, etc. What they do is they have this piece of software, this program that's designed to learn. And this program will learn whatever it gets, basically, the information that you feed it. So if it's trying to mimic a person, you have to give it hours and hours and hours of video, as many different angles, as many different aspects, of many different colors and lightings of this person. And over time, thousands and thousands of hours, millions and millions of bits of information, the computer starts to learn. It starts to learn to recognize this person, and it starts to learn to mimic this person. And over time, it can get better and better. This is the idea of using this method of growth in order to build a much more stable system. The downside is, of course, that it takes longer. And usually, since this is the case, the system starts out at its most vulnerable state. And that's what we see in nature time and time again. At the beginning stages of development, the system is always the weakest. Whereas if we're talking about usually something that we're building, more or less once it's built, no matter what it is. And in fact, over time, we'll often see more of a deterioration, meaning that usually when we're talking about mechanically, we build something that is at its peak when it's first made. And then as time goes, it actually loses that stability. And so this is why I think it's very, very important for us to learn about this way of thinking, where what Fukuoka really did was look at a system and recognize that that system was doing something that was entirely unexpected from his point of view, and that it was outperforming the other system that he learned. The fact that nature had developed this organism, this species, this system, and it was doing a better job than humans were doing with all of their money. And indeed, we see the sort of same thinking with the AI developments. Now, I'd like to take a moment just to tell a little bit about my personal story with Fukuoka and with this book. As I've mentioned a few times before, and I'm assuming most people who are listening will already know, it was in India that I really went through a lot of the processes that brought me to where I am today. That was certainly where I began my journey. And I remember reading The One Straw Revolution, the book by Fukuoka, and finishing it and really feeling a very strong sense of understanding. As far as I'm concerned, that was a very big piece of the puzzle that sort of fit into place. Because if that's true, if what he was claiming was true, and obviously it's been proven by this point, but if that is the case, then the way we are living our lives right now is completely wrong. And what I mean by that is that this is the vision of the eco-village in general. People are living their lives completely indebted to this work system. And the reason so many people get forced into that system is because it represents our survival. Meaning we depend on it to get food and water and shelter and the rest of the things that we need. If we can envision a world where nature is doing all the work for us, as it has been doing since the beginning, and what we need to do is really and truly just reap the benefits, as it were, then suddenly we free up all of that time that we were wasting on trying to grow food. Because the time that the farmers are wasting on growing on food is what costs money all throughout the process and what we're paying for in the end. So this system, although it may seem like it's very distant from us in food production, I hope in these times people are a little bit more aware of the instability of our food system, but nonetheless, I think it's very important for us to be aware of our options, and certainly considering the fact that the future is mostly unknown and we don't really know what's going to happen. It's very important to remember when we're thinking about, okay, how do you grow your own food? How do the farmers do it? I've seen them use tractors, I've seen them use acres of corn, and I've seen them pouring fertilizer and burning all the weeds. And that might not just be the best way of doing it. I see one comment in chat that the problem isn't just growing, it's harvesting too. Indeed, I'm not saying that there's no work, and we can get into a huge discussion about how to harvest, how much, what plants, preservation, etc. Definitely the lifestyle and the diet that we're used to is one that is not in sync with the cycles of nature. And in fact, a very big part of what Fukuoka talks about is only eating plants that are in season, not eating things that are out of season. Well, that already is a huge change of lifestyle. And obviously the things that, in order for this to work, it would demand certain things. But nonetheless, it is important to remember that with these things, the problem of growing food was considered a huge amount of work. And if we're talking about now harvesting an acre of corn, then that again is a huge amount of work. If we talk about wandering through a food forest and grazing as you go, that's a very different type of harvest, and I'd say those may be two extremes. And then in the middle, you've got a lot of wave of where you can be. Yes, oh, well done for recognizing Fukuoka, exactly. So that's a very good point. There's a lot of work, especially involved in the establishment of these systems. I don't want it to seem like I think that there is less work in this than in anything else. Absolutely not. But when I'm talking about established systems of a lot of perennials and a lot of trees, which means things that don't require a lot of work and still produce every year, hopefully more and more with an increasing yield. When you talk about mushrooms and all of these different things, you can really get to a minimal amount of work, even when it comes to the harvesting and preservation, as long as your climate is forgiving enough, let's say. I don't want to talk about places where it's a very short growing period, which has its own problems, very cold climates with frost, etc., etc. Obviously, there are going to be challenges everywhere. But this concept of establishing a sustainable system that carries on improving and grows more stable and more robust over time is something that can be implemented anywhere and will improve any other kind of system, obviously, because by definition other systems would require more work over time and would deteriorate over time. So yes, we've got a few trees that we've just planted. We've got a plum tree that we're very excited, and it's got one little plum on the top. It's I think it's 2 or 3 years old. So, but you don't plant trees to really harvest, because you plant vegetables. That's the quickest return for your buck, I think. We plant trees for the long term. And the best time to plant a tree was, what was it, last year? There's some Japanese saying, I think, but definitely we're planting for the future, not just for our personal gain. And cherry trees are a great wood, so if you could, if you wanted to start coppicing as well, that's also something you could do. But definitely, I'm waiting for the fruit. So yes, as we said, natural farming is the topic of this episode, and specifically, I think, talking about this natural approach to life. And so this is something that I want to talk a little bit about, and it might be slightly off topic from Fukuoka, but I think it's important nonetheless. When we say natural farming, in fact, we're talking a lot about nature. And I think it might be time to start trying to understand or trying to define what exactly we mean when we say the word nature. Because obviously we have these two opposing worlds, one which is man-made, mechanical, theoretical, conceptual, etc., and the other which is natural, animalistic, evolutionary, physical, etc., all of these, this dichotomy between these two. And yet, when we try and define what exactly we mean by the word nature, we get a little stuck, because the word is a little too inclusive for a dichotomy to really exist. And that's when we get into a lot of these discussions of what it actually means, man-made, if everything comes from nature and man came from nature, so everything that man makes ultimately comes from nature. It's a discussion that I heard recently. A friend of mine was actually writing an interesting article about it, about the definition of organic. What substances do we define as inorganic? And in fact, what methods of gardening we define as organic? Obviously, there are legal definitions, and those will often also include a certain amount underneath which, it's allowed or it's excused or it's so small a part that it doesn't count. But there's always that legal line that you have to draw, which doesn't really exist in nature. Exactly, plutonium is natural, cyanide is natural, lots of dangerous substances, and in fact, it's very difficult to start defining which of these substances becomes unnatural. If it was made in a laboratory as opposed to being made in the center of a sun, it's a little bit of a anthropocentric distinction to say that the one is man-made and the other is natural, since as far as nature is concerned, it's all natural. And in fact, when you come to these chemicals interacting with the natural world, they still interact because they're still made from the same basic blocks. It'd be interesting if another dimensional chemical would come into contact, how that would look, and maybe that would be a truly unnatural substance, I don't know. But at least in terms of this dimension, when we really try to think about the natural world, we obviously include the sun and the moon and planet Earth in general in that definition. And so when does that stop? If we include the galaxy, or if we go further, we really come to a problem when we're trying to define what nature is, where it ends. And so this term natural farming got me thinking a little bit about what that really means. So I'd be interested also to hear in the chat if you've got any comments and answers of what you think what nature means for you, because for me, I use the word quite a lot. And whenever I use it, as I have indeed in this episode, I always use it in contrast to man-made, mechanical. In fact, when I'm talking about natural systems, those are systems that grow, and unnatural systems, as it were, systems that are made, systems that are created. There seems to be a very clear distinction between the two, but it still becomes very hard to decide when something stops being natural. And so I think when it comes to our definition of the word nature, it's really hard to avoid that acceptance that no matter how much we would like to think that we're special, and no matter how much I would like to think of myself as something elevated above nature, something unique in creation, as far as nature is concerned, as far as the sun is concerned, as far as the galaxy is concerned, we are certainly still a part of it. And I think that's both a humbling and an important lesson for us to remember, especially in this day and age. And so I'd like to, how much have I got? Okay, we're halfway there, so that should be okay. I see I've got one comment here. Most people think natural is just high medieval technology. Interesting. I'm not sure if that's a joke or a serious comment, but but yeah, it's an interesting line to put when we talk about even that word technology. Obviously, when we talk about technology, we talk about computers and phone screens, but I mean, the manifesto of Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, was typed on a typewriter, and I think it's I can't remember, not the Mormons, the Amish. I'm terribly sorry, but the Amish don't believe in technology past the 19th century, if I'm not mistaken, the 1800s. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that's still a line that's drawn. They use, all the farming tools. They use a carriage, etc., to get around. So all of these lines that we say technology, it's really lines that we choose to draw, to place them, and they're always going to be based of our perspective. Yes, Ron, exactly. Burundon, I don't think I've seen you in chat before. Welcome, thank you for joining. Both natural and man-made. That's probably the closest statement to the truth that you can make, so I definitely like that. Yeah, exactly. All of these technologies, as you say, using a plow, following seasons, basic crop rotations. I mean, by definition, the apes that we see who use stones, or even birds, crows, will pick up a rock and use it to smash a snail, or I can't remember other birds who use that, will pick up crabs and smash them on the rocks. That's a form of technology, a very crude form nonetheless, but it means, again, that line between natural and man-made is a very difficult one to draw. I think the examples that we can see in the animal world obviously are very interesting, because especially in today's modern era, we seem to be studying it more and more and seeing how animals interact with modern technology and what are the differences of how they behave. And it seems that as far as the animals are concerned, this modern technology is no different than any part of their reality. Obviously, it behaves very differently than, let's say, a fruit, but they are interacting with it. It affects them. They understand to their level what's going on. And so it's a very weird phenomenon to be aware of when we think of the situation, and when we think of ourselves and what's going on, we obviously have a very, very anthropocentric, a very human-based perspective on what's happening. And this human-based perspective was painted and affected and shaped over a long, long time with a lot of very religious ideas that we still have to a certain degree inside of us. One of those ideas that started in religion and indeed carried over to science was that nature, and by this we mean sort of the great outdoors, was our testing ground. And it was open for the taking, and we could basically come and do whatever we want. I can't remember the exact quote, but there's a quote of laying nature on the torture board and extracting her secrets. I can't remember the exact quote. I do apologize if anyone has it, but it's a very specific way of looking at our relationship with this environment. And I think that perspective is shifting over the last few years. And with the last part of the podcast that I've got now, I think this relates very well to what we see around us today, indeed. It seems that a lot of people were really taken by surprise. I guess all of us were in a way, but I think a lot of people suddenly felt very, very helpless. And this obviously comes about when there is a false sense of security. And we sort of have forgotten what nature can really be like. I mean, sure, there's an occasional, I don't want it to obviously minimize, but as far as our personal lives are concerned, when we talk about natural disasters, they don't affect our life as much as they did once. And for most people, they don't actually experience them many times. Obviously, for most of us, we don't meet many dangers in the form of wild animals or any kind of natural environment that we have to face that can actually endanger us. And we've really grown very disconnected from that feeling of awe that you get when you're face to face with a wild animal. If any of you have ever experienced that in any setting, even in a zoo, if you actually stand there for one moment and feel it, and certainly without a cage, it's something that we don't experience. We actually walk this earth as an apex predator with a phone in our hand, but we never feel threatened. And then this virus comes along, and I must admit that I'm not feeling threatened by it personally, because I deal with viruses on a daily basis. But nonetheless, I see many people suddenly reacting to this natural occurrence as if it were one of these man-made disasters, because that's what we've grown accustomed to. We're currently, if I'm not mistaken, waging a war on terror and waging a war on drugs. And these are concepts, these are very man-made things. And even if not, we've always had these enemies, these people at our gates. It's been a long time since we've had to, wage a war on the lion or go and conquer this forest because there are, a pack of wolves that are eating children. I mean, these used to be much more common occurrences, and obviously over the last 100 more years, we've certainly lost any kind of threat that we felt. And I think those threats are important, not to be real threats, but to put us in our place. Because as I was saying, the human perspective is one specific perspective, but can be very limiting at times. And I think if we learn to humble ourselves, to be able to see ourselves as part of a much greater network of things, and that network involves the sun and moon, and involves the plants that we eat and water that we drink, but it also involves viruses that evolve and mutate and come every year. And it also involves germs, which have evolved side by side with humans, or I should say, humans evolved side by side with them because they were here first. And all of these different things that can technically harm us and endanger us are all part of this infinitely complex system that we call nature. And so I think that in these times especially, it's even more important for us to remember not only that this virus and all viruses are natural occurrences, and I say that even with viruses that are quote-unquote man-made, because as we said before, all of these are still natural occurrences. I don't think anyone is yet building a mechanical virus, probably not far away, but even that, in a way, if it acts as a virus, will be a natural occurrence. And the thing with naturally occurring viruses are that our bodies are developed to deal with them. In fact, that's exactly what evolving alongside viruses means. It means that our systems and our bodies have to learn a new way of dealing with and surviving this threat, because otherwise we'd be wiped out, and that's exactly what happens. So if we come this far living with all of these threats, we should all remember that we are living in bodies that are designed and built to deal with them on a daily basis, and we have been doing so since the day we were born. I just want to read the comment very quickly, and then I will carry on to close to the end. How much time do we have? Okay, we're doing okay. So 100 years ago, because it looks like a good comment, 100 years ago, all food was organic, so the word organic food did not exist. A carrot was a carrot, but then the chemical giants started brainwashing humans, and DOA, what's DOA? Started poisoning our food with toxins. Now we have organic carrot and carrot. The normal carrot is probably glyphosate in it, and we put poison in our foods. From alien perspective, it's a ridiculous shit show what we do with our food. Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Every word you said, absolutely. And yes, I mean, what you said about food can easily be said about many other fields that we have. Poisoning our food, poisoning our waters, poisoning our airs. And indeed, it comes from this disconnection that we have with these systems. And this is something that obviously the whole concept of the eco-village model is meant to repair and help heal. The understanding that we are all part of this system, whether we like it or not. Therefore, we have to learn to live with it because of that. But indeed, when it comes to this natural way of farming and looking at it, I think it goes even further, because it sort of suggests that human beings have taken on a certain role with agronomy, with space exploration, with medicine, with all of these different fields. And that is the role of improving on nature. Once again, that word. And how do we improve on nature? We find the systems that are in place and we try and tweak them, or we try and learn from them in order to better them. And it sounds like I'm inherently against this viewpoint. I'm not inherently against it, because I believe that it can be done, as this is exactly what nature is doing all the time. It's improving on itself all the time. That's what the definition of evolution is. Evolution is only one way. Things don't devolve over the time in the same way. They grow more complex. There's obviously entropy, but that's a very different system than evolution, because things are constantly learning from what happened. Species aren't unlearning things. And so nature with these systems is constantly trying to improve itself. And I do believe that humans, as part of this system, can improve upon systems that were here before. In fact, the eco-village model is an excellent example of that. However, as Fukuoka did, I think it's vitally important, especially now for all of us, to re-examine the quote-unquote improvements that we've discovered, to re-examine what parts that we are doing now are not actually as helpful as we once thought. And perhaps it's time to let go of a lot of these systems that we seemed to think would be an improvement, and over time have proven to not be an improvement, or in fact they haven't proven that because we have never tested them. We've never re-examined them. We've never actually gone back. And in fact, I mean, this will be a big topic, so we're not going to go into it, but I've spoken about it before. I think the system of finance that we have is an excellent example of that, whereas we have this system that we pretty much invented in order to deal with large-scale social organization and in order to sort of maintain and have oversight and really be able to manage this interaction of people and businesses, as it were. And I'm not sure if today, as we see the different crises that are happening and the different crashes that are going on, whether this current system is the absolute best system, whether there are no parts of this system that might be improved upon or indeed let go of altogether. And I'm sure most people in the world would agree with some of that statement, that these systems do demand a re-examination. But when we re-examine them, it's vitally important for us to actually look through this lens of natural systems and to use that as our guideline for the best solution. What is the closest resemblance to a natural solution, a natural system? What is the solution that we see that requires the minimum effort and that decreases the required input over time, and obviously with that increases its stability and its level of operation, as it were, over time? And when we look for a system like that, if we'll give a very, very small example just to sort of make it a bit more practical. I could really give any example on any subject if you have any thoughts, but let's talk about the system of education, because that's an easy one to implement it. When we see children, we see them being treated, at least until now, let's say, not with some of these new systems, but children were treated as bolts and nuts, different parts, different cogs in a machine that needs to be, the pieces need to fit, and so you shape and mold, and those were the words that they used, the child's mind into where it needs to think. This system is a mechanical system, viewing human beings, children, as machines that need this. And the natural system for this, as it were, the counterpart, would be a system that would allow the children to grow with the information. And so instead of having a mechanical input-output, blackboard, copy-paste system, you would have the system where the learning would be a part of the child's everyday life, as it were. And at least in my mind, this is the system that would be much more beneficial to children's learning and has been shown today. A system that over time, instead of children, as we see, getting less and less excited about going to school and learn, children getting disinterested over time in various subjects, you actually see children developing more and more interest, and children learning how to learn better over time, which seems to be the exact opposite of what happens in a lot of these systems where universities are getting kids who have no learning skills. They have these sort of, book skills, I don't know what to call them, copy-paste machines, mimicking students, but they don't actually have those developed skills of learning, because as time went on, both the teacher and the students were being worn down by this mechanical system that was decreasing in efficiency instead of evolving and improving and in fact growing with the students and with the time. So that's just a very small example. I could I could talk about that example for a lot longer, but I think in our lives as well, not just talking about food production, but when we think of things that we do, maybe I'll give another small practical example just very quickly. This was something that my wife shared with me that was very interesting. She was watching something about Marie Kondo. I think it was a YouTube channel of someone who was talking about the system. So Marie Kondo, for those who don't know, is this, I think she's called a minimalist, as it were, life coach. And she comes to people's houses and reorganizes their lives and wardrobes. I've never actually watched an episode, but that's what I've heard. Anyway, this woman who was talking about it was talking about laundry. And she said that she had stopped with actually going around the house and collecting all of the laundry from each room. And instead, everyone in the house started bringing their laundry to the basket. And then when she would come the time for folding the laundry, she would have a much more simple system of folding. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was basically not to waste all of that time sitting and folding it into the neat piles and then taking it around, but actually having it all concentrated in one place. And she did the calculations and she'd figured she was saving, whatever it was, about 10 minutes every day, which multiplied over the year became a huge amount of time on something that really didn't require it. And there are lots of these examples when we think about cutlery and silverware. So how much time is spent on getting the dishes and the cutlery out and then washing it and then drying it and then putting it back? Those are 4 different actions that are done pretty much with every meal. And if, as we spoke about before, we think about the concept of grazing, if you have a garden with fruit, with nuts, with berries, with perennials, maybe some greens, you could wander and eat, and you would be saving all of the preparatory time of cooking and preparing the food, the time for using the dishes and the cleanup. All of that would be saved with this very, very simple idea, let's say, of grazing. And so that's just another example of how we can be creating a lot more work for ourselves to maintain a system that demands that we keep inputting that work. Now, this obviously doesn't always work, and I'm not saying that these examples specifically are right for anyone or that any of this is, earth-shatteringly different because you still have to do X, Y, Z, and whatever. But what I'm trying to encourage, if in any way this helps, is that we maybe re-examine some of the old patterns that we've developed, some of the ways that we think about doing things, or in fact, don't think enough about doing things, and see if maybe we're wasting energy in doing something that we don't necessarily have to do. Because the more of those areas that we can find to sort of skim, as it were, and take off some of these extra work that we're doing here and there, it always comes back to us. And this is something that I'm sort of developing. It's a fantasy of mine. I'll be honest with you. I don't know how far you can take this. I don't know how far it can go. I'm certainly planning on checking it out. And in my mind, I would like to see an established system where 90% of the work is just happening by nature, as I know that these things happen, and I can really sit back and enjoy the fruits. No, I wouldn't actually sit back. I'd be going and doing other things because you always want to build and improve and do things. But if I wanted to on certain days, I could sit back and take a moment. So we'll see where this actually ends up. I can't guarantee anything yet. I can point, if you're interested in real life examples of people who are actually doing these things, then obviously there are many of those that you can look. And for me personally, I will be updating about our progress as we move forward. So that's pretty much it for me. I can see I've got 5 minutes. So let's just very quickly check through the chat. Yes. Oh, Crimson Clad, you like her? Yeah, she's great, Japanese minimalist. What more could you possibly want? It takes me 3 minutes to microwave burritos, then I throw away my styrofoam plate and soak my fork. Very efficient. That is very efficient indeed. I mean, you know, have you tried just microwaving the burritos without a plate? And see how it comes off then. No, I'm joking. Obviously, I mean, to each, obviously there are different areas I think that these can be applied. I, in this podcast, focus very much on homesteading, self-sufficiency, food production, etc. And yet I would love if for other people, as it is for me, these ideas and these concepts could sort of spill over to everyday life as well. I mean, it's sort of a mindset of trying to see inefficiency and trying to recognize inefficiency in ourselves and what we're doing with our time, how we're actually spending it. Okay. Oh, I can see a few more messages. Yes. Oh, and someone has uploaded a quote here. Who is this from? I can't see. Hang on. Sorry about this. Anti-commie blood. I'm just going to check very quickly. Oh. I think I heard this quote just the other day. Okay, it's a bit long. I'm not going to read it right now, but for those who are watching the video, you'll be able to see it in chat. Just pause the video and be able to read it. But that's very interesting. Where is that quote from? I have to ask. Okay, for those who have listened this far, I will just say, if you're moving on, thank you very, very much for listening. It's been an absolute pleasure. I will remind you that next week is the last episode in this series of the 5 methodologies. And next week is going to be all about keyline farming. For those who've heard, for those who've never heard, it's a subject that's very close to my heart. It's all about water management on the farm, but in fact it has real world applications for everyone as well. You seem to see a pattern here developing. Anyway, so yes, if you're interested, please come and join next week to the live show. And then in fact, as I mentioned last episode, there's going to be a bit of a change of pace. And I'm not sure what that will do to my audience. I hope that not too many of you will run away screaming. No, I'm joking. But it's going to be a little bit of a different topic that I'll be talking about. I feel that it all still very much relates to the eco-village, because that solution comes as a response to a problem, or many problems, that we have in society today. But I feel that these problems, with the recent developments of Corona, with the way things are shaping up, with the way that things are moving in the world, I've been privy to a lot of information that I have not shared with many people over time, mainly close people, but not anyone outside, and certainly not in this kind of setting. And it was a long debate for me of whether to do this or how. So I think I'll talk more about that next week. Oh, I can see I'm almost out of time. Thank you very much for joining me. It's been a pleasure as always. I've been Olev, and I wish you all a good night and see you next week. Bye for now.